Hello, guys. This is Mr. Cole. We are by now finished up with the war in Vietnam and on to Unit 9, our last unit. Now, I wish I could have, given you our last notes packet in class. Is always very nice, but I think I did give them out already. So you should have your Unit 9 notes packet. If you need me to send it to you, please let me know. Sorry, this is the way we have to do our last unit, but that's kind of how it goes. So, our last unit I just called the modern era, which, granted, I don't know exactly how modern it is anymore, but it's from the 1970s to the present. So the last 50 years of our country's history, what was going on and what the major events were, okay? We will just follow this one in a true timeline. So essentially starting with one president and moving to the next president and moving to the next president about how eventually we got to today here in 2020. Part one will deal with the 1970s and 1980s. I call it a conservative tide, and that is because, really we have from 1969 to 1992 only 4 years of a Democratic president, right? Every other year in that time was a Republican president. And as a result, the country takes a much more conservative approach than it did throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, that were much more of a liberal time. If you would remember, starting with FDR's New Deal, from 1932 until 1969, there had only been one Republican president. Well, now it flip-flops, and now we go for about a 30 or 20 to 30 year stretch of only basically Republicans, except for one Democratic president in there. So it's a very conservative time. And with that, the big themes that we're going to talk about are going to be, what was the role of government, right? What is the government's response to a lot of issues? As you can imagine, with a conservative president, a lot of it's going to be kind of hands off. And then as well as we'll eventually get to the end of the Cold War. So our first section, the only section we're going to do today, is about the environment that you see in the 1970s. The beginning of an environmental activism, trying to make their environment better. The roots of the environmental movement actually began with a book. The book was called Silent Spring. It was written by Rachel Carson, and it was a book about the use of pesticides. Now, pesticides are chemicals that were sprayed on plants that would kill insects from eating those plants and killing those plants. Now, the common pesticide that was used was called DDT. And the DDT was essentially poisoning us and poisoning the people who worked in the fields. But we didn't really know, or if they did know, they hid it and covered it up. Essentially, what happens is that DDT affects and causes a lot of mutations and defects. It is especially worse on other animals, so it wasn't as bad on necessarily on humans, but it was really bad on birds and anybody that ate the insects or ate the fruits off of the trees that had DDT on them. So the book Silent Spring is written by Rachel Carson. So here's what I meant. So they would just fly over as crop dusters, spray this stuff all over fields. That stuff would get in the air and you'd breathe in. It would cause a lot of health problems. Rachel Carson's research, she called it Silent Spring, basically insinuating, a springtime where when you wake up in the morning, it's silent outside because all the birds are dead from having consumed the DDT. And with that, she, warns of a time that, we could have a silent spring in our country. With that, the book is so shocking and so prevalent that it actually starts a movement on its own. And you see the 1970s, a movement towards trying to take better care of our environment, researching into pesticides, trying to stop the pollution, the first research into global warming, which we know is still an issue today. In 1970, we celebrated the very first Earth Day. That has been going on now annually every year since this. That came out as a result of this environmental movement. Now, the way the government did it, Richard Nixon was president at the time when this book came out. And Richard Nixon is going to create the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, whose job it was to basically set and enforce pollution standards. They are basically the police of the environment. They go and they do research. They go and they set standards. They inspect companies that they suspect are dumping chemicals or dumping waste into the air or into the water. And they basically have the power to bring about fines and take these companies to court who are polluting and killing our environment. Along with this, Nixon is going to pass the Clean Air Act, which gave the government the authority, the ability to set air pollution standards. All of our cars have certain standards of the amount of pollution that they're allowed to let out. And so the EPA does inspections of those. Factories have a set amount of stuff they're allowed to release. And so the government is in charge of looking at and trying to protect the environment. Just to show you kind of how bad it really was. I mean, obviously there's still environmental issues today. But here is out in a lake or in an ocean or bay somewhere, just a washed up VW Beetle just in the middle of the ocean. Here's New York City with the haze that came from all the cars and all the pollution from all the cars. You can't even see, with how hazy it is, you can't even see some of the major buildings. Like right back there are the Twin Towers, and you can hardly even see them through all this haze of all the pollution. Industrial waste was a major issue. Basically, if you had a company and you had a waste from chemicals that, the garbage people wouldn't take away, then you just took it down to the river, threw it in the river, and moved on. And of course, that stuff we know obviously ends up in our lakes and in our oceans, and in our drinking water and things like that. So you can see on a beach next to kids playing, you can see some sort of chemical, vat, I don't know how to describe it, that, washed up onto a beach, meaning some company had just dumped it into the water. Most famously, what actually really led to the creation of the EPA was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and sorry, Cleveland people, but the Cuyahoga River throughout downtown Cleveland area is lined with a lot of heavy industrial factories. And so those factories would just take the waste and dump it in the Cuyahoga River. Well, the river became so heavy with waste that it actually lit on fire. And so this is an image of the Cuyahoga River on fire. So obviously, if a river can catch fire, that means that there's enough oil and enough chemicals that, that's some problem, right? Water should not catch on fire. But with that, this was just an example of how bad it really got. Here's some pictures from the environmental movement, right? And some of the protests. Along with that, one of the major issues environmentally became nuclear energy. As oil prices get higher and higher in the 70s, Americans start turning to using nuclear power plants. These were new technology for the time. Basically, the idea is take the same power that's generated from splitting an atom when you blow up a bomb, but do it in a controlled way and use that energy then into electricity. The problem is it produces radiation, and if it's done incorrectly and the nuclear reaction gets out of control, that radiation can spill out into the atmosphere. And that actually happened at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. The nuclear reactor melted down. Basically, it did not stay controlled, and the atoms started splitting themselves on their own. Radiation started spilling out from the plant into neighboring communities. And it really became a big debate as if, nuclear power was the way to go. For the most part, America still uses quite a bit of nuclear power. When it's done correctly, it is the cleanest way to produce energy that we know. Well, other than, renewable resources, but it's one of the cleaner ways we know to produce a lot of energy. But if it's done wrong, it can go bad like it did at 3 Mile Island. So anyway, with that, your assignment is to actually read a quick excerpt from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's one of the famous sections called A Fable for Tomorrow, and you'll get an idea of kind of why she was such an influential voice in the environmental movement. Alrighty, see you guys.